Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of 30-Minute Thursdays, otherwise known as 30 Mint, where I bring you my weekly dose of fresh ideas and insights that are helping me to perform at my best. From my favorite recovery hacks, training philosophies, and analyzed guest insights, I will come prepared each week in hopes that you can apply these snippets to your everyday life. Now, let's get to the show. If you like it, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes. And for the true fans, leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. This helps the show get discovered organically and helps me to continually bring on amazing guests for the main show and keep these rolling out for you each week. Today, I will be covering how to structure your training to fit your lifestyle. In this episode, you can expect to hear my opinions on training frequency, training intensity, recovery days, and ever-ready preparedness. I hope you enjoy the show. All right, friends, let's talk about one of my favorite things that I have been hacking over the years, going on the better part of 16. I've been training since I was a teenager, and through my whole life, I've been constantly resolving this problem of how to properly train for the sports you love to do. One of the biggest underpinning themes in my life, and the reason that I train, the reason that I've fallen in love with this as a career, and the reason that I do this every single day, week over week over week, and I help my clients try to enact habits that allow them to do the same, is this idea of ever-ready preparedness. Ever-ready preparedness is my internal philosophy on being able to do anything that life throws my way. If someone invites me to go on a surf trip, I want to say yes. If someone invites me to go hike a series of mountains, I want to say yes. If someone invites me to join them for a jiu-jitsu class, I want to say yes. Essentially, I never want to let my physical body, provided it's in my control, limit what I'm able to do in life. That's my purpose for training. The aesthetic benefits of training are great, and it's awesome to feel good in your own skin. But the reason for why I train and what shapes the majority of my training structure is the fact that I want to be able to go do things that I love to do. I don't want just muscles for the sake of muscles. It doesn't make any sense to me anymore. I want to be able to go do activity. That's why I train. And when you have a purpose behind what you're doing, it begins to affect the structure, the intensity, the frequency, and how much you need to focus on your recovery. I try to talk about this with my clients a lot because most of the time when someone comes to you and they're trying to make a change in their life, it's aesthetically driven. Usually they want to lose weight, they want to add muscle, they want to fit into something that they didn't before, they want to get ready for a vacation that's coming up. It's typically a time-bound item and it has an end point. What I found to be problematic with these types of goals is that once you achieve that thing, there's nothing really holding everything in place to keep the habits that you built to stay there. The reason that this idea of ever-ready preparedness is so valuable is because it's a lifelong endeavor. Age is going to happen. You're going to lose some of your ability. We're all going to get older. We're going to get slower. We're going to get weaker. It's just part of life. But if you can do things pragmatically in your training to prolong your longevity and stave off those days when you can't do things, that's a huge win. And that's something that will continually surpass the end point of all these goals. If, for example, you set a goal to run a marathon and you run it, there's no telling how you're going to react on the day after the marathon. Will you maintain your run volume? Will you maintain your training volume that kept you healthy to do the run volume? Will you sign up for another marathon? Will you start doing ultras? You never know how you're going to react based on that experience. But if the underpinning goal is that you want the opportunity to continually pursue these endeavors in the future, that's going to keep this a part of your life. It's going to keep you training. It's going to keep you showing up. It's going to keep you finding things that continually test the limits of what you're capable of. And I personally think that that's a beautiful thing. That's one of the reasons that I got involved in jiu-jitsu, is because it was a physical application for all this training that I'd been doing. It was a purpose behind the exercise. Constantly going in and just putting in effort after effort in the gym at some point gets monotonous. And if you don't have a place to express that or a place to go take those hard worked days and put them into action, it can become a little bit boring. So having those things in your life that are the answers to this, are you ready? Can you go do this? Are you prepared? When the answer is yes, because you're training, it's fantastic. So I really think that this idea of ever ready preparedness is something that everyone can adopt, something that everyone can pursue, and the range is endless. It could be something simple like you want the ability to play with your children for the next 15 years. You want, I was talking to my friend Casey yesterday, and he said being able to show up for his daughter is a really important part of being an adult for him. So a lot of the training that he's doing, although he was a former fighter, crazy Muay Thai fighter, consistent grappler, the big underpinning why this ever ready preparedness is to be able to show up for the people in his family that he loves. That's a beautiful thing. And training is something that can provide that opportunity where otherwise life events and just age in general start to take that away from us. So I wanted to talk about ever ready preparedness in the beginning here because it's really going to set the tone for these other principles that we're going to talk about when you're really considering how to structure your training week. Because here's the crux. Trainers hold all the information. We know how to build the programs. We know how to design weeks and macro cycles and microcycles and achieve certain goals based on the training structure. And the downside to that is I think that the everyman, the person who is interested in training but doesn't know exactly how, feels very limited. And to be fair, not everyone has access or the finances for high-level coaching, which is really the only place to spend your money in the training industry. That being said, this understanding of training structure, there's a couple principles that are really important that I think that every person can adopt and every person can take into their own hands to better prepare themselves for life events. And you, although it's great to have the expertise of a professional and a valuable coach, if you adhere to some of these principles, you can start to shape in your own life your training structure. You can do this at a public gym. You can do this in your garage. You can do this anywhere. But these principles of frequency, intensity, and recovery are extremely valuable in doing that safely and building for the future. So let's talk about training frequency. The best place to start when you're thinking about frequency is the things that you love to do most. So let's say you are a grappler. You know that to become a proficient grappler, you have to grapple a lot. It's not a sport that lends itself to training every once in a while. So if you're someone who wants to grapple and stay safe, and you want to know how to train for that, what commonly happens is people just train frequently and add grappling in. The downside to that is that unless you're a freak athlete or you have a history with a really talented coach and guidance, that's kind of setting you on the track to at one point be overworked, under-recovered, and that spells injury. So when you're thinking about frequency, you have to start backwards. How often do you want to do the sport that you're doing? If you're a runner, how frequently do you want to run? And based on your goals, what constitutes your frequency? If you're training for a marathon, you have to run very differently than if you're training for a half or if you're training for a 5K. The same is true for cycling. The same is true for pickup basketball. You need to be playing the sport a lot. So the best thing to do when you're adjusting frequency is to start with the minimal frequency that you can consistently do in your schedule and build on it when you have control of it. With the grappling example, here's where I came into it. Olympic weightlifting, competing in Olympic weightlifting, strength training 4 days a week at a high intensity. We'll talk about intensity in a little bit here. And then I added jiu-jitsu in. It took all but 6 weeks before I tweaked my hip very badly because I was doing all this hip flexion loaded exercise in my Olympic weightlifting, front squats, back squats, power cleans, jerks. And then I was going in and getting smashed on the mats as a white belt who's brand new to this art form, who doesn't know anything he's doing, using a ton of strength, zero technique, and getting banged up. Now, 5 years later, 6 years later, my training is the least frequent part. My strength training is the least frequent part of my total training frequency because I wanted to maximize jiu-jitsu training to 4 days a week. And I've learned through serious trial and error that a 2-day-a-week frequency is the best and most frequent, consistent amount that my body can handle at my age and state, training intensity, and jiu-jitsu frequency. So to unpack that, start with the sport that you're doing, whatever it is, surfing, jiu-jitsu, being active with your kids, whatever it is. How many days a week do you want to do that? From that, you will see in your week the space that you can dedicate to training. And it can be one day, it could be 2 days. If you're only doing the sport or the activity a couple days a week, maybe training takes a bigger part of that. But the important thing is that you're starting to understand the relationship between your outputs and your inputs. So I like to start low. Start with one. When you're starting with 1 day a week or 2 days a week, you are limited to some degree in how complex each of those days can be. So when you're thinking about intensity, which is how difficult these sessions are going to be, you have to spread that out over how many days you have. So if you have more days of strength training, you can accomplish a bigger variance in the days that you're doing that. If you have less, those days are going to need to have a more static approach because there's much more time in between the days of training. So start with training frequency. How many days can you allot for the activity that you want to do? How many days can you allot to take care of your body so that you can do the thing that you want to do and mitigate risk in the process? It's a very important part. What I have found to be the best structure for me at this point, having competed in Olympic weightlifting, having been in a training hall since I was 15, having taken up jiu-jitsu later in life, and having decided that I want to prioritize how many days I have on the mats, is I just strength train twice a week. That's it. I strength train twice a week, and I don't push it beyond a certain point. If it feels like I'm really dialed in and I'm super on board, my body feels awesome, fully recovered, there's no sticking points, that's a day I'll allow myself to push it a little bit in terms of resistance. But the majority of the days that I train, I'm maintaining. I'm just trying to maintain the strength that I've built over my life, take care of my joints so that when I'm on the mats, they have the best opportunity to be recovered and perform. And then I'm letting training dictate how I feel about the rest of it. So that's my structure. 2 days a week, strength training. Each day is full body. That way I cover all the planes of motion, pushing, pulling, knee flexion, hip flexion, core strength. It all fits into both of those days in about an hour. And time is a really important part of how I'm training. I don't want to be in the gym for 2 hours like I used to be. I want to be in the gym for an hour tops. Get my training done, keep my body healthy, and go about my day. Because I know that I'm going to be putting longer sessions in when I'm at the training hall at jiu-jitsu. So let's move next to training intensity. How do you decide how hard to go? Here's how you decide when you're younger. You just go hard all the time. And I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday as well. If I knew when I was younger what I know now, like everyone says, I would have prioritized my recovery so much more to allow myself to perform at higher peaks throughout my training. But what I did was I just always went hard in my strength and conditioning. And when you're constantly doing that, you're wearing down your engine and your ability to show up the same the next day. It's one of the reasons why athletes love to cheat and do steroids. What do steroids do? They allow you to recover at a rate that is unprecedented to those not using it. So you can show up the next day and go just as hard in back-to-back sessions. Stress the body and get an insane repair and allow you to build strength and speed at a rate that is unfair. For those of us not using steroids, your training intensity becomes a very, very important part of how you make progress. And what you will learn, the way that I like to do it, is based on what's called an RPE scale, ratings of perceived exertion, which is a fancy trainer term for a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being impossible, 1 being very easy. When you're training, you want to manage your intensity somewhere on the higher end and in the middle so that you have an undulation in the output, so that you're not constantly going 10-10 or always going 6-6. But you have days and variants where you push the pace a little bit more based on how you feel, based on how you're recovered. If you're a runner, these could be days where maybe you try to improve your split time a little bit. If you're surfing, this could be days where you're out for a longer session. Maybe you're going for 2 hours instead of an hour. Intensity is all scalable to the sport that you're doing because it's a measure of output, a perceived internal measure of output. It's how do you feel about how you're doing today? And that scale becomes very important because you will be inundated when you're strength and conditioning with everyone's opinions on what you should do. Even listening to this, you're getting my opinion on what I recommend people do based on where they're at. But in doing that, it can be easy to distance yourself from how you actually feel. And when it comes down to it, your strength and conditioning and thereby all the progress that you will make is going to be a result of 1, your efforts, 2, your recovery, and 3, your management of intensity. That's going to be what makes you stronger going forward, what helps you maintain strength beyond that point, and what helps you stave off injury when you're doing the sports that you love to do. So in conclusion, training intensity can be thought of very simply as a 1 to 10 scale. If you're training twice a week, you want one of these days to be a little bit higher than the other so that you have variance in your output. You should do this based on how you feel on the day. That can take into account your rest and recovery, how well you slept the night before, pain and sticking points, so what joints, parts of your body are kind of barking at you and what ones feel good. Of the ones that are barking, can they be addressed in the session and made better before you start training, or are they things that are chronic and they're starting to build up? It's an important question to answer because that'll structure how you start your training session. An example would be if your hip is extremely tight and you go into your training session and you have plans to squat, maybe you have to dedicate 15 to 20 minutes to that hip, getting it mobile, flushing some of the blood out of there, bringing new blood in, and then getting into the session. So that question is really important. What is barking at me, and can I address it before this session? So if you start to think about those things, they will help you arrive at this decision prior to starting your training session. That's going to help you regulate intensity. And I do this every single time I train. It starts when I wake up. I check in, immediately on how my body feels. Then later in the day when I start to train, I assess going into training how my body feels. If things are adjustable, I adjust them. If they're not, I work around them. And working around starts to regulate intensity. Because if you are working around an injury, you know you're going to downregulate your output because you have to so that you don't get further injured. Intensity is a really important thing to consider. And the best way to do this, in my opinion, is to start to track it. If you go in and every day you just guess, there's no feedback. You're not building any data on yourself. You don't really know how you're feeling on that day. So journaling can be a valuable tool for this. Keeping a notes section in your phone, using an app that helps you do that. I use Juggernaut Strength Training. They have an app. It helps you based on a series of questions, just, check in with how you're feeling. It asks you about your rest, your recovery, your body weight, top to bottom, how your body's feeling. And then it helps track this on a graph so that although you do have a good internal system, you can reference this and go, hey, every Monday, I'm a 7 out of 10 ready. And every Friday, I'm a 4 out of 10. Wow, I must be getting beat up during the week. Maybe I need to adjust some things in the week to better prepare myself for this Friday strength training day. That's just an example. But getting some sort of metric on yourself of how you're doing, a simple check-in, is really valuable. When I was in college, well before there were fitness apps in abundance that you could utilize, I did every session with a composition training notebook, the ones that look like a cowhide on the outside. You write your name in the middle. And on each one of those days, at the top, it says energy and sleep. And I would rate my energy 1 to 10. That's on the day that I'm going in. And I would rate my sleep, what I thought was the night before, which as a college kid was abhorrent. So that was one way where I would start to take stock of how I was feeling going into it. Intensity shows up in strength training by way of resistance. So if you are going to regulate up or down the intensity of an exercise, not deciding what your intensity should be for that day, but now you have decided to say, hey, this is a day to put forth more intensity. One of the ways to do that is to scale up resistance. Another way to do that is to perform more exercise with less rest. So you're doing more capacity in the same amount of time, but you're not allowing yourself to recover as much in between. You can change the footprint or handprint of an exercise and then regulate the resistance around that. So there's a lot of opportunity to change intensity of an exercise without just thinking of it as adding 5 more pounds to every exercise. That kind of variance is really important for sport, because if your sole way of making things harder or easier is just changing weight, but you're never changing the complexity of the movement, you're never changing the plane of motion that you work in, you're never changing the rest or recovery, that type of training isn't necessarily going to really improve your ability to perform this sport. So when you're thinking about intensity on the day that you're training, that's another thing to consider. Complexity, duration, weight, resistance, loading, position, all those things matter. So I would recommend considering intensity heavily when you're going into the session based on how your body feels. That will help you make more progress over the same amount of time as someone who is not considering intensity. Or in a perfect world, you utilize a program or an app that does this for you, that helps regulate based on percentage-based lifting and your relative maximums for each exercise, how to perform in that zone. So next, we'll talk about one of the most important, by and large, the most important concepts that I've spent a lot of time recently investing in mentally and physically, but also just respecting my body more and more over time, and that's recovery. Frequency and intensity will get trumped every single time by a lack of recovery. And I really, really, really wish I knew this when I was younger. I just didn't value it because I hadn't felt the negative side effects of being under-recovered. Now, grain of salt, recovery is a hot topic right now. There's a lot of businesses, facilities, and people in the training industry investing capital into creating places to recover. And this is awesome. Just like DBC Fitness that I was at yesterday in San Diego and Carlsbad has this epic recovery center. It's awesome. And I am such a fan. And I'm very, very glad that these places exist now for the general population and for athletes. But it can take a commanding amount of someone's focus. So it's important to remember that recovery is a component of training, just as much as training is a component of training. To properly structure your recovery days, again, you have to reflect on how you feel as an individual. If you have neck injuries, if you have joint pain, elbow pain, rib pain, low back pain, knee pain, and you're just trucking through that, it's probably an indicator that you need to address your recovery protocol. Recovery encapsulates a lot of things. This is stretching, mobility, and flexibility work. This is sauna and heat and cold exposure. It is compression therapy. It is lacrosse ball work. It is myofascial release. It is soft tissue therapy, manual therapy, acupuncture. The list goes on of what can fall under recovery, but the big principle here is that it is low intensity on the body. The goal of this work is to downregulate your nervous system and get you in a state where your body can begin to repair itself on a cellular level and on a nervous system level. Because training is taxing to your nervous system. It is a lot to put your body under the stress because, like I've talked about before, when you're strength training or conditioning, you're tearing down muscle fibers. You're causing destruction to the body on a cellular level. And so you're wanting that process to work towards recovery so that you can come back and you can perform the same actions with a heightened state of ability. With recovery, you want to downregulate. The only trap I see people can get stuck in is they become obsessive compulsive about recovery to the point where it's almost become a new stressor in their life. So if we look at the week, again, I always start with what you want to do. If you know the sport that you want to get better at, you know the activity that you want to maximize, you look at your training frequency of that. How often are you going to be doing that thing in a week? You look at your intensity. How often am I going to be training and on what intensity on the days in between to support the sport that I love? And then, equally important, which of these days am I going to spend recovering? And that's an important question to ask yourself, because if you're like me, the answer is 0. I've always wanted to just maximize the output. It's my nature. And so I've had to work really hard to decide that some of this time is going to be spent not doing, but undoing. Sundays, I just don't do anything on Sundays. Maybe I'll play golf, but I don't let myself train. I don't let myself strength train. I allow myself to recover, sauna, cold therapy, stretching. And then I've found that for me personally, baking in a stretch routine to every single day at night is totally manageable. I can do it before bed. It gets me ready for bed as opposed to being exposed to screens, LEDs, blue lights, things that promote alertness. It gets me away from that. I go through this routine. I stretch down my whole body. It's also a great point to check in at the end of the day of what are my sticking points from training that week, that day, the previous hours. And it gives me a staple in my flexibility and my mobility to focus on every single day. That's one area where I get recovery. Then I just bake it into the other points in the week that allow for it. For example, if I'm training Monday and Wednesday jiu-jitsu in the middle of the day, after training, I'll sneak over, do cold therapy, heat therapy, 20 minutes. I know it's restorative for me. I know it's helping me get back to a baseline where I can keep pushing myself. And that's a great place for me to fit it in. That might not be something that you can do in the middle of the day. Maybe you can't even do it in the end of the day, but you can do it in the morning. Maybe you can't do it in the morning, but you can do it in the end of the day. These are all questions that each person has to ask themselves to decide how they are going to maximize their recovery in their week, because it should be a non-negotiable. And I stand firmly on this now, being well on the other side of several injuries and a complete disrespect for my body and its ability to recover. It's important to prioritize this. And I feel crazy to even say this, but I would always recommend to anyone that you program your recovery days first, then program your training days around your recovery days. Because if you respect those recovery days as sacred and you hit them every single week, you will find more benefit recovering twice, training once, and repeating that than training 3 times, recovering 0, and eventually getting injured. Then dealing with the sadness, the depression, and the annoyance of being injured and unable to do the sports that you love. So prioritize your recovery days. Make time for them. Carve them out, whether it's 20 minutes or an hour and a half. It really doesn't matter. You don't need a ton of time thrown at this, but you do need to spend some time bringing your body back to a place where it can be pushed the next time you do the thing that you love to do. So, in conclusion, training frequency, training intensity, and recovery days should all be thought about from a 7-day-a-week view. Where can your training days fit that support the activity that you love? Where can the recovery days fit that support the training that allows you to do the activity that you love? And how hard should you be training on the days in between based on how you're feeling in the sport that you love to do? If you think about those things and nothing more, think about them when you're training. Think about them when you're doing the activity that you love to do. It will begin to guide your choices. And it's a great stepping stone between where you're at and getting into a training program that's a little bit more demanding, a little bit more structured, with strong periodization or utilization of an app that does this for you. It's a great thing to do to start to become in tune with how your body feels and what it's ready for. That concludes 30-Minute Thursdays. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this stuff is connecting with you and that you're finding little tidbits, 1 or 2 each week, that you can apply to your day-to-day life. I think it would be overzealous to think that every single thing in these episodes connects with people. So I get that if you skip around or you jump from part to part, I totally respect that. But I hope that some of these things hit home and inspire you to change the way that you train, to change the way you think about the activities that you love to do, and most importantly, change the way that you recover so that you can maximize your outputs in those things and maximize enjoyment. So if you're still here with me and you've enjoyed this episode, you got a little bit out of it, please take 30 seconds, leave a 5-star review on Spotify. I cannot tell you how much this helps the show grow. It helps it positioned in front of other people that are listening to similar things, and it's the exact type of growth that I want for the show, which is organic. Built by the listeners, built by the audience, giving tidbits to people that really need it. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. And I can't wait to give another 30-Minute Thursdays next week. Also, stay tuned. This Tuesday, very, very exciting. First in-person podcast episode has been recorded. This has been a long-time goal of mine for over a year and a half. I've always wanted to do an in-person episode, and we finally knocked it out of the park the other day. So this Tuesday, October 10th at midnight, tune into the YouTube. You can see us in person. We got multiple camera angles, insane audio, great visual. It looks so sick, and I can't wait to bring it to you. Thank you so much. Good night.